Right, so the topic is basically about the hard disk drive industry, which has a high concentration in Thailand. So let's recap what I explained to you last time in Jakarta a little bit. So the fact is that probably you know that Thailand was hit very badly by floods in October, November 2011. That's more than 3 years ago, and it did have a huge impact on the global supply chain because hard disk drives are used in various products, including PCs or TVs even nowadays, and other products. Now, HDD production in Thailand is greatly affected, and this is important because the share of HDD production in Thailand was more than 40% at the time of the Thailand floods. And indeed, it was exporting a lot of hard disk drives to China, so which means that the production of PCs and other products in China were affected because of the disruption in the production of hard disk drives in Thailand. Okay, so there is clearly an international network being affected by natural disaster here. And indeed, the export value of hard disk drives from Thailand was affected greatly. So if you look at, is that this one? Right, so it was, there was a big fall in value. It's year-on-year changes. The fall was more than 80%. So what I would like to point out, and I did point out last time, was that basically the hard disk drive market or industry is an oligopoly. There are only 3 main players. One is Western Digital, and then there is Seagate and Toshiba. There are only 3 now. And they actually may have exploited the opportunity of flooding to collude and keep the price level higher, which means that there might be incentives not really to invest in risk prevention. Okay, so because of the the larger question is that who bears the cost of prevention? Okay, if you can enjoy some profits because of natural disaster, why you want to invest in prevention? Right. So let's look at the background. This is a new part. Right, so as a background, the hard disk drive industry has been experiencing a rapid consolidation in the past 10 years. So the first one was that Seagate purchased Maxtor, so the number of players declined to 6, and then Toshiba actually bought Fujitsu's HDD business, and so on. And around the time of the flooding, there were 2 further acquisitions. Samsung's HDD business was bought by Seagate at the end of 2011, so that's immediately after the flooding. And Western Digital bought Hitachi's HDD business in March 2012. So that's immediately after the flooding. And both of them were announced before the flooding. Okay, now, because of these new acquisitions, there are only 3 players. And indeed, Western Digital and Seagate are the 2 dominant players on the market. Now, if you look at the main factories within Thailand, Western Digital had 2 large factories in 2 industrial estates, and one is Ban Paing. It's north of Bangkok, and another one is in Nakhon. So both of these were affected seriously by the floods. And Hitachi, they had a factory in Chonburi and Prachinburi, and they were not affected by the floods directly. But Toshiba had a factory in Nakhon, and that was severely disrupted. And now, but then that was sold to Western Digital as a deal. There was a big deal going on, and there was a competition issue, so that's why they had to release this one. Now, Seagate, on the other hand, wasn't really affected directly by the floods because their factory wasn't located in the inundated area. So you can see that Western Digital was the one who was mostly affected by the floods. Okay. Now, it's a little bit complicated because because of the mergers and acquisitions, but I put the line manually, so it might not be really accurate, but it's around the time of October, November. Okay, so the purple line is indicating the periods of floods. And the market share of Western Digital and Seagate now are about 40%, meaning that Toshiba has only just over 10% market share. But so because of the acquisitions of the two businesses, clearly the two Western Digital and Seagate are the dominant ones. The market share of Western Digital immediately fell immediately after the flooding because their factory was affected. And indeed, you can confirm that by looking at the number of units shipped, and based on the quarterly data, and the same thing applies. Okay, so Western Digital's number of units shipped dropped radically, immediately around the time of the flooding.
This is market share data?
No, this is the market share data, and this is the number of units shipped. Okay. Right. So I wanted to serialize what was happening, and the basic model, which usually set to apply to the hard disk drive industry, is the Cournot model, which means that the firms control the quantity, and this part is the inverse demand function, which maps quantity from quantity to price. Okay, so if you know the demand, and then you know the price. You control the quantity so as to maximize the profit. So P times Q is the revenue, and then you have the cost. And you can put in a CI if I'm indexing by I, the firm. So if the cost structure is different across firms, then this should be heterogeneous. But I'm just putting homogeneous because more or less the cost structure of the two companies are very similar. So what's happening is that they choose the quantity so as to maximize profit. That's the basic structure of the Cournot model, given the other players' behavior. Okay, so the solution to this problem defines the best response function. Okay, now this graph illustrates the nature of the Cournot-Nash equilibrium of that model. In the competitive market case, price equals the marginal cost. So this point should be the equilibrium quantity, and the price should be this one. It's equals to the marginal cost. But then if you have oligopoly, the red line will be the marginal revenue, so that this one is going to be the equilibrium quantity. So it's much less than the quantity, equilibrium quantity in the competitive market. And the price should be higher. Okay? So in an oligopolistic market, you have a lower quantity and a higher price. And indeed, if you have a smaller number of firms, the red line pivots clockwise, meaning that you have less quantity and a higher price, okay, overall. And this is a static case. Now, what happens if the firms in the industry can form a cartel? Then you can basically behave as though this is a monopoly, okay, rather than taking other firms' behavior as given and then having a non-cooperative game structure. You have a monopoly. Then, I'm going back to the previous slide, the quantity will be as though you have only one firm. So the quantity would be lower and the price would be higher. Okay. Now, Radner wrote a paper, some time ago. It's actually more than 30 years ago, studying the possible deviations from the Cournot-Nash equilibrium and investigating the impacts of the the number of firms in the industry, and the length of the time horizon. Now, what he investigated is that, and actually found out, is that if the number of firms is sufficiently large, then for a fixed epsilon in a time horizon, it's some parameters, then the cartel cannot survive. So if you have a large enough firms, then cartel cannot survive. Okay, so that breaks down. So then you will have a non-cooperative gain. However, if the time horizon is sufficiently large relative to the number of firms, so meaning that you have a small number of firms, but a very long time horizon, then a cartel can be supported at an equilibrium. So the firms could act as though they are a monopoly. Okay, so that sustains a higher price. So it could be that the fact that the number of firms in the hard disk drive industry decreased over the time contributed to this. And indeed, it may well be that the flooding in 2011 triggered the move or the shift to the new equilibrium. So let's see what was happening by data. So this graph is showing the average selling price per unit of hard disk drives. Unfortunately, I couldn't get data from Seagate because Seagate didn't really disclose the data before the merger with Samsung's business. So haven't got the data. However, Western Digital have been disclosing all the data for a long time period. And you can see that the average price was falling before the flooding, but then it shot up after the floods. It fell a little bit, but it's fairly stable in the past 2 years. Okay, and the same applies to Seagate, especially if you look at the red line after the flooding. Okay, so it seems that there was a regime change before and after the floods. And I just picked up the Western Digital's data. It has a longer time horizon. And indeed, there was a steady fall over the periods before the flooding, but after the flooding, it's been quite stable. And I looked at the gross margins of the two companies. Again, there was a regime change probably before and after the flooding. It was lower, it was about 20% before the floods, but then after the floods, it's close to 30%. So there is a substantial difference, which appears to support the hypothesis that the structure of the market changed. And so this is looking at the gross margin of Western Digital alone for in the past 10 years. It's been rising and fluctuating, but there seems to be a regime change. Probably we can test that. I didn't test it formally, statistically, but there seems to be. And one important aspect, people pointed out last time in Jakarta was the effects of inventories. And I looked at inventory turns, and Western Digital's inventory turns tended to be higher before the flooding. It fell sharply immediately after the flooding. Now, if the economic condition is rather bad, then the inventory turns should be lower, but it could be, that it could be reflecting a strategic behavior. If you expect the price would go up, you don't sell it immediately and keep the inventory level higher and then ship later. And that could be the case here. Okay? In general, the inventory turns have become lower for Western Digital, not really for Seagate. So that's a little bit in a mixed picture. But at least for the Western Digital case, it seems to be there was a difference between before the floods and after the floods. Okay, so there was a steady decline, but then there seems to be a difference. Okay, the level is different now. So we haven't been able to formally test the model or the predictions of Radner's model, but the price data at least supports or not rejecting the predictions of Radner's model. Okay, so it may be that the Thailand floods triggered to form a de facto cartel, and the formation wasn't probably possible before the consolidations of the industry before 2011. But one thing we need to do formally is to isolate the effects of floods from the effects of consolidations. That's something we haven't been able to do by just looking at the data, of prices. We need a more formal analysis. So that's one task we need to do still. But if our hypothesis is correct, there are some policy implications. So our analysis suggests the need for competition policies beyond national boundaries because, again, as I said before, the question is who bears the cost of prevention? If the firms are not willing to invest in risk prevention, then there must be something done because overall, probably it's the consumers who are bearing the costs exposed. And exposed costs tend to be higher than ex-ante prevention costs. And if firms don't prevent anything, then they're prone to flooding. That means that the consumers will bear the costs eventually. Okay? So, and also what we can say is that the present case study is basically exploiting a natural experiment situation because of flooding, and we can basically quantify and analyze the major change to an oligopolistic market. Okay? And that involves studies that measures the impacts on the social welfare, that's a consumer or user loss. Okay? And this is particularly important for ASEAN because ASEAN is a base for industries that have a global value chain. And what we can do to prevent the impacts of natural disasters would be important, but as I said, if the firms haven't got the incentives to invest in risk prevention measures, that's really problematic. Okay. Now the last slide. So the study so far is incomplete. It's half-baked, I admit, because we haven't been able to isolate the effects of consolidation and the floods. So what we need to do is to adopt some structural estimation strategy, which is common in industrial organization literature, and quantify the magnitude of the social welfare loss due to market reorganization or the shifts of the equilibrium in the market. And in particular, what we need to do is to see how the price pass-through have affected the lower chains, okay, and quantify the impacts on the social welfare as a whole. Okay? And that's something we haven't been able to do.